This video is an exercise in theological interpretation. We want to use a particular text from the book of Philemon and seek to understand the theological grounding that is a part of that text. So we've been studying the epistles and the format of the epistles and the genre of the epistles. Now we want to do a deep dive, as much as we can in a short video, of the theological content of a particular statement by Paul. Our text is Philemon, verses 17 to 20. This text has a long history of discussion. And you can imagine when we're talking about slavery and the New Testament and Paul and theology and Christ, that gets pretty messy because of how Paul approaches this and how he describes the situation. It has been used by some. For example, before the Civil War, Philemon was used as justification for the fugitive slave law. Paul returned Onesimus to Philemon. So should not slaves who have gone on the underground north, should not they be returned to the south? I mean, isn't that the example of Paul? And we should follow Paul's example. In fact, Alexander Campbell argued that very thing. Though he was a gradualist in the liberation of enslaved peoples, he believed you should obey the law. And the law says you should return those who have run away, those who have escaped slavery, you should return them to their masters. And Philemon became a proof text for that. Others, like abolitionists, including Alexander Campbell's sister and the person who was the responsible for establishing Butler University, what we know as Butler University, they suggested that Philemon contained the kernels of abolition. And so it should not be read as a way of justifying the fugitive slave law. So my interest in this particular video is to lay out kind of a theological case for not necessarily abolition, but Paul's expectation within the Christian community that master versus slave is not a dynamic that functions within the Christian community. And that Paul is calling Philemon to a different standard, a different reality, a different kind of community than what is experienced in the Greco-Roman world. We might even say that Paul is not really advocating or hinting at a social revolution as much as he is articulating a vision for the reality of new creation within the Christian community. So how do we get there from here? I mean, after all, Onesimus is returned to Philemon. And Philemon is a owner of people, a slaver. So how do we understand what Paul is doing and what his letter represents? First of all, it's important to notice that this letter is not just written to Philemon. Yes, the you is usually singular throughout the letter, but if you notice in the first couple of verses, it's addressed to presumably his wife, who is kind of co-householder with Philemon. It's addressed to Aristarchus, and it's addressed to the whole church. So we might imagine this letter being read in the context of the community. This isn't just a private correspondence with Philemon. It's kind of a public letter to Philemon that the church is going to hear. So that creates some kind of communal context for the hearing of this letter. What we also have to remember is that Onesimus is apparently a recent convert. Paul calls him my son in the faith. And in sending Onesimus back to Philemon, he is sending not a slave back to Philemon, but a brother, a family member. And he reminds Philemon of that. But the heart of this, I think, is verses 17 to 20, where the only imperatives in the letter occur here. Except for one at the end where he says, prepare a place for me, I'm going to come visit. So only imperatives other than that occasional visit imperative are right here in verses 17 to 20. Before this, he doesn't tell Philemon to do anything. He just reminds Philemon of who he is, that he is the refresher of souls, that he is a leader in the community, and that he tells Onesimus' story about how he is a son in the faith now and has been returned. In 17 to 20, though, we get to the heart of the matter. Let's read. So if you consider me your partner, welcome him as you would welcome me. If he has wronged you in any way or owes you anything, charge that to my account. I, Paul, am writing this with my own hand. I will repay it. I say nothing about you owing me even your own self. Yes, brother, let me have this benefit from you in the Lord. Refresh my heart in Christ. The three imperatives in this text are welcome, charge, and refresh. These imperatives certainly connect to Paul's relationship with Philemon and with Onesimus. And so there's a relational community that's involved here, a sense of brotherhood or family, or a sense of connectedness in Christ. And the appeal could be seen as simply a do me a favor kind of appeal. But I think Paul's doing more. I think Paul is rooting this in a theology of Christ. He's rooting it in the gospel. So, for example, when he says, welcome Onesimus as a brother, the word welcome is a heavy word. In fact, we see Paul using that word in Romans chapters 14 and 15, where he uses it 3 times in talking about welcoming each other in Christ, to accept each other in Christ, because Christ is the one to whom we are enslaved. We are servants of Christ, and therefore servants of each other. So the idea of welcoming is deeply rooted in what God has done in Christ. As N.T. Wright put it, God is in Paul reconciling Onesimus and Philemon. So I think that's what's happening here with this word welcome. It offers Philemon a way to participate in the gospel. If you really believe this story of the gospel where God has welcomed us in Christ and therefore we welcome each other as fellow believers, not as slaves and masters, if you really believe this story about how God welcomes us in Christ, then you will welcome Onesimus. Paul is not just asking for a relational favor from a friend. He's calling upon his friend to fully embrace the gospel and welcome this person, Onesimus, as a brother. Then to say, charge it to my account, is actually a Christological move. It's exactly what God has done in Christ when, as we see in Philippians chapter 2, that though he existed in the form of God, he did not consider it something to use to his own advantage, but emptied himself and took upon himself the form of a human being. He brought redemption or ransom. He took the debt that was ours and paid it himself. You see, this deeply rooted Christology that Paul is working with here, is coming out in this charge it to my account. That's not just a business transaction. That's a kenotic transaction. That is the kenosis of Christ emptying himself for our sake. Paul is following the model of Christ and emptying himself for the sake of Onesimus. And Philemon needs to recognize that grace that Paul is exercising here. That just as Philemon has received this from Christ, so Philemon needs to also give it to Onesimus. So Paul is acting in the role of Jesus by taking on the charge, taking on the account. And then the last verb is refresh my heart. He'd already said to Philemon, you're a good man. You refresh the hearts of the saints. So if Paul is calling upon him to continue that model, this time in relation to a slave, To Onesimus, who has returned, how is he going to treat Onesimus? Refreshing, renewing, giving rest to Paul's heart. Actually, the word heart here is guts. It refers to the inner person, the inner guts of a person. That kind of gut feeling where the center of affections and emotions, and you feel like you got hit in the gut sort of thing. Paul says, I'll give rest to my guts. If you believe this story, then you will welcome Onesimus. You will put it all on my account, and we will refresh our hearts together. And the community will be refreshed. And the community will see a picture of how things work within the church itself. Paul is not here advocating some kind of social revolution. Paul didn't live in a participatory democracy. He lived in an empire. It was not within his grasp to change the social economics of the empire. But it was within his mission for the Christian community to be a witness to a different sort of relationship, a more fundamental and primary relationship in the family of God. This is not mere advice. Earlier Paul says, I don't want to force you to do anything. But you notice what he says in verse 21, which we didn't read. Paul says, I am confident of your obedience. Whoa, where'd that word come from? I'm confident of your obedience. Maybe it came from Philemon's embrace of the gospel story. If he truly believes in the gospel, then he will welcome Onesimus as a brother, not as a slave. And that is the kernel of a liberating movement within the church, it seems to me. And it's deeply rooted in the gospel.